family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. Hope you had a great weekend, and maybe you watched the Super Bowl. Tom Brady set records once again, and so congratulations to Tampa Bay, but especially to an individual who has actually won more Super Bowls than any NFL team, been in more of an NFL team. So, you use the phrase sometimes GOAT, greatest of all time. I think that one fits pretty well, and so if nothing else, thought I'd mention that briefly. As a matter of fact, while I was kind of watching Twitter, because I always kind of like to see what people have to say about the game, about the commercials, about the woke Super Bowl this time. I saw that Brett Hume actually quoted from a piece by Rod Dreher. And it's so good that I made it our first article that we'll get to in just a minute. So I thought that was something that was a benefit just even as we are watching the Super Bowl yesterday. But before we do that, I recognize quite a number of you listen to this program this hour are from Texas, and you might know a little bit more about what's going on in Texas. And there's kind of a legislative priorities tracker that is put together by our friends at Texas Scorecard. So I thought it was kind of interesting because it helps us understand where are we in some of the priorities. And one of the priorities for the Republican Party is election integrity, and there have been a number of bills that have been filed in both the House and the Senate. Another issue is religious liberty, and bills have been filed also in the House and Senate. Then a topic that we will get into in about 2 hours with Preston Sprinkle on his book Embodied, dealing with this whole idea of transgenderism. And it's a very good book, and it deserves an entire hour unto itself. There are some bills about children and gender modification filed in the House, nothing in the Senate. And then the whole issue of abortion, abolition of abortion, no bills filed on that at all. School choice, no bills filed there. The idea of taxpayer-funded abortion, taxpayer-funded lobbying, I should say, excuse me. That one is, again, bills filed in both the House and the Senate. So just a couple of things to get you thinking about that. What are some of the Democratic priorities? And again, these come from their platforms. One of the high priorities for Democrats is the legalization and decriminalization of marijuana. And bills on that regard have been filed in both the House and Senate. Another priority is expanding abortion, trying to remove all restrictions on abortion. And bills in that regard have been filed in both the House and the Senate. Bills to actually ban fracking, well, so far none of them have been filed. Repealing voter ID is another priority of Democrats, and there are bills in both the House and Senate dealing with that particular issue. So I've picked out just a couple, but it, I think, illustrates only so well that there are a number of pieces of legislation being filed. Last time I looked, does this have the number here? I saw it somewhere else, where more than 2,000 bills have been filed, and if nothing else, I think it's almost 2,400 now, getting up to about 2,500 bills. You recognize some bills have no chance of being passed, but it does also illustrate that there's just sort of an overload of legislation, which then has to be seriously considered in various committees. And then if it passes those committees, then has to go to the calendar committee, which sometimes determines whether or not it'll even get a hearing on the floor. And then if it passes both the House, then it has to go to the Senate, or if it passed the Senate, it has to go to the House. So there is a long, difficult, and torturous process for any legislation, and I just thought I'd give you that brief update, and we'll try to give you that from time to time as we go along. The first article I've posted here comes from Rod Dreher. Now, he's been on the program with us a number of times. We've talked about Live Not by Lies. And if nothing else, I thought this was very interesting because he's quoting from a columnist. Actually, it appeared in the Los Angeles Times, but she lives in Brooklyn Heights. And even though she lives in New York, she's sort of more in a rural area, because that's going to be important, because he entitles this the snowplow test. And the point he's making is that this is a writer, Virginia Heffernan, who's really facing a great question, really, if you will, almost a moral dilemma, because her neighbors did something nice for her. She, in New York, is definitely pro-Biden, and the neighbors that did something nice for her actually supported Donald Trump. And so you would think, well, and what's the problem? As a matter of fact, Brit Hume said, we used to live in a live and let live kind of philosophy, but no longer, because Rod Dreher points out the fact she doesn't really know what the right thing to do is. And he says, now stop right there. Normal people don't have this problem. Normal people think, oh, how nice, start thinking about ways to return the kindness. But the normal people are not Harvard-educated, New York-based liberal journalists, hence her column. Because the point is he says, these Trumpites next door seem devoted to our ex-president. But again, they just plowed my driveway without being asked and did a great job. So how am I going to resist demands for unity in the face of this act of aggressive niceness? If by now you're not rolling your eyes, then maybe you're like one of the individuals like her that says, I can't be nice to these Trump people. After all, they're the reason we have all the problems in our society. And of course, that's my comment, not hers, but I think it's a realistic reading of all this as well. And of course, he says at some level, this Rod says, I realize I owe them some thanks. I guess she says this. And it really looks like this guy did a good job of doing this. It's kind of weird because he says, back in the city, meaning New York City, people don't sweep other people's walkways for nothing. But, of course, it takes a New Yorker to start wondering, okay, what do I do with this? And so finally she comes up with an idea. I know, after the attack on the Capitol, I remember this guy by the name of Senator Ben Sasse, and he actually said that really what he was calling for was for Americans to love their neighbors. He said, United States isn't Hatfields and McCoys that blood feud forever. Instead, he said, you can't hate someone who shovels your driveway. So now she's come upon this. I know they plowed the driveway because they heard Senator Ben Sasse, one of those Republicans, say that you should do something nice for people. Again, if you think I'm over-exaggerating, you need to read the column because it's something else. And so she's saying, but also, I guess I should acknowledge the Sassian move with a wave and a thanks and maybe something like that. But also, I can't give my neighbors absolution. It's not mine to give. We can't forgive them for voting for Trump, I guess is what she's saying. Free driveway work, as nice as it is just not the same currency as justice and truth. To pretend it would be is to lie. Besides, they probably aren't asking for and looking for absolution anyway. At this point, Rod Dreher goes faceplant. I mean, these people. So after the break, I want to talk about this because he's trying to, if nothing else, explain to them these people may not even know who Senator Ben Sasse is. They're not looking for you to give absolution. They're not asking for you to forgive them. They're just being nice people, and you have definitely overthought this. And if this is something that causes you to roll your eyes, we'll continue talking more about what it means right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Recent surveys show that millions of Americans doubt that the 2020 elections will run fairly. That is why a number of state legislators are filing bills and considering what changes need to be made before the next election cycle. In fact, Senator Rand Paul announced on one TV program that he will be spending the next 2 years going around from state to state and fixing these problems. He and other members of Congress might also spend a significant amount of their time in Washington trying to fix a bill that will likely pass the House and could even pass the Senate. The Democracy Restoration Act of 2021 is H.R. 1, meaning it is the first bill in Congress. It is similar to the For the People Act I discussed last year and was passed by the House of Representatives. Instead of trying to address some of the concerns millions of voters have with the way the 2020 elections were run, the bill attempts to go even further in the wrong direction. The bill essentially requires states to do away with nearly all election rules that exist to prevent election fraud. All states must have mail-in voting. All states must have automatic registration to vote. All states must have a period of early voting. All states must allow anyone to register the same day as an election. The state may not require an individual to provide any form of identification as a condition of obtaining an absentee ballot. The bill vastly expands ballot harvesting. It says that a voter can designate any person to return a voted and sealed absentee ballot to the post office, a ballot drop-off location, tribally designated building, or election office. There's much more in the bill, but you can see just from these few examples that this isn't election reform. It's a prescription for more problems in the next election. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, the first article here is called The Snowplow Test, and Rod Dreher does such a good job. I'm going to read a lot more of it, but again, you can read it in its entirety because I do skip around a little bit. But if you just joined us, we're talking about a columnist who lives in Brooklyn Heights, kind of in a rural area, so sometimes it's important to plow your driveway. And those Trumpites next door actually decided to do that. And she even admits that the guy back-dragged the driveway like a pro. But should I give him thanks? I mean, after all, they're, actually partisans and they're Trumpites. And we're in New York. And how in the world are there any of these people even allowed? Oh, I know. They probably heard Senator Ben Sasse saying that you should go and shovel your neighbor's driveway. And you can't hate somebody who shovels your driveway. But then she says, okay, well, maybe I should thank them. I'm not going to go over next door, she says, and give them a covered dish as a thank you. I mean, this woman is really going at it. And I can't give my neighbors absolution for all of this. So in the midst of this facepalm by Rod Dreher, he then, now this is mostly Rod Dreher speaking from Mellon Point, saying, let me say something, Virginia. Your neighbors probably have no idea who Ben Sasse is and isn't going to reconcile with you, much less receive your absolution. They just wanted to do something nice for you because you are their neighbor. And that's what neighbors do to each other. The fact that you assume that there must be some politically aware motive behind the action says a lot about you. He says, I grew up in the rural South. Rod Dreher grew up in Louisiana. That's going to be important in a minute because we're going to talk about how an African-American's in a gambling a poker game with a former KKK member. So it's, this is the South. But anyway, he says, I grew up in the South. And he says, look, nobody stopped to ask what one's politics were when you were doing something nice for them. This is not how people outside of blue state cosmopolitans live. As for absolution, I kind of hope you try to engage your Trumpist neighbors. Don't try to descending on high to tell them that you might want to wash their sins away with the pure milk of liberal kindness. Rod Dreyer, you are such a good writer. Nevertheless, I said this would be fun to watch, though. The neighbors might know perfectly well that you hate Trump, but if they are like normal people, they don't care. They're your neighbor, and your driveway needed plowing. It didn't occur to them to think that they needed to know something else about you. Honestly, this is the kind of MAGA heads in the mist take that really calls for putting on Sweet Home Alabama, blasting it as a top volume and shouting these lines against this judgmental hypocrisy. Now, again, it goes into some of the other things, but then she also says, now, Watergate does not bother me, but does your conscience bother you? Tell the truth. So, no kidding. To people like Virginia Heffernan, every check their own conscience. Do they believe that they are not sinners in need of forgiveness? And does Auden's great command, you shall love your crookedly neighbor with your crooked heart, somehow not apply to them? And here's the story. Rod Dreyer grew up in Louisiana, so it's this great story. He says, I know a Latino immigrant. I forgot that. I made him African-American. He's Latino. Okay, so my mistake. I know a Latino immigrant who moved to a small Louisiana town for years ago, as a matter of fact. I was talking to him about what life was like there, and he mentioned how much he enjoyed playing poker with a group of men he'd fallen in with. One of the men had a familiar name from my Louisiana childhood, and then I remembered that decades ago this man, now quite old, had been a leader of the Ku Klux Klan in the state. So I asked the Latino guy if he knew that, and he said, oh, yeah, but he's really not a bad guy once you get to know him. And I thought, that's small town for life for you. It's like the town where I grew up, too. You cannot afford to be mean to and judgmental of people, even if they have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, which, believe me, you have done, too. The guy you need to call to saw up your tree that fell across your driveway might have a MAGA and NRA stickers on his truck. He might also do it for free because he knows you've been sick and have medical bills. Many of my friends today back in my hometown are liberals, and I'm sure life is not as pleasant for them in some ways as it would have been if they lived in a blue city. But then again, very few people back home talk about politics and certainly wouldn't use politics as a reason not to be neighborly. If you live out in the country, you can't afford to be that way, and besides, it just doesn't matter that much to us. So then he talks about another story, which I think is very relevant to what we're going to talk about in about 2 hours, because he talks about another town that he knew of where a liberal friend there told me that back in the 1980s, a gay male couple moved to town. One of them was dying of AIDS and wanted to live in the country for as long as his life was left. They started attending the local Episcopal church. My liberal friend said that nobody at the church flew rainbow flags. I think he speaks metaphorically here. But they also welcomed this couple and cared for them with meals and chores and companionship until the very end. If you polled the congregation back then, you probably would have found very few who have said much good about homosexuality. And back then, people were a lot more afraid of AIDS than they are today. But that did not matter. What mattered was that here, in front of us, in the flesh, were two people in need of love and care, and that they received because they were neighbors. Doesn't make this particular small town, he talks about paradise, but it does make it humane and livable. And he said the local liberals may chafe at their minority status, but they're nice people too. One of my best friends back home is a super liberal, and he wouldn't think twice about rushing out to help a neighbor like her, the writer for the Los Angeles Times, whatever her politics. It just would not cross his mind to do anything else. This isn't a left-right thing. It's basic human decency. The lady who runs the coffee shop in my hometown is pretty liberal, and her clientele, no doubt, is mostly conservative, but nobody cares. Why should they care? Are you a kind person? Do you treat others with respect? Then you're welcome, even if your politics leave a lot to be desired either way. I don't know if it's like that outside the South, but down here, it would be a sorry man who wouldn't plow his neighbor's driveway on account of the fact she hates Trump. You get the point? This column is so revealing. Is that really how urban media liberals see the rest of America, as a place full of people as bitter and judgmental as themselves? Her column is what happens when people who have extraordinary power to shape the media discourse live in a political monoculture. It's like the weird phenomenon in which the psychological research to determine what is normative for humans has been done solely by Westerners whose psychological profiles are very different from those of people from around the world. The baseline of normal behavior is actually quite misleading. The theory goes because the psychology of people formed in the Western, educated, industrial-rich cultures is meaningfully different. A friend of mine lives in a country resort town that has been overrun during the COVID tide with rich coastal liberals escaping the plague. He says they have made life there miserable. They're snotty, entitled. They treat the locals as exotics to be patronized. They say they are bringing with them the same attitudes towards life that ruined California. I bet that's some of those neighbors who are happy to help. And they're also happy to see the back of her, too, carrying those high and mighty liberal attitudes back to New York. Bless her heart. Virginia doesn't know any better. She's a product of the elite colleges in urban liberal media culture and doesn't understand that one doesn't politicize neighborliness, I should say. One doesn't look at one's neighbors and sort the decent from the indecent based on how they vote. If our big city newsrooms had more people in them who had a real understanding of and sympathy for people like the snowplowers, we might not be such a divided country. But we all know that when the papers hire for diversity, they mean they want to get 10 different flavors of liberal. I might mention that Rod Dreher knows that because he's written 4 newspapers, including the Dallas Morning News and the New York Times. But nevertheless, at least he's had New York Times bestsellers. I know that for the fact. So anyway, he says the snowplow test. Do you live in a place where people will plow your driveway without wanting something in return because it's the neighborly thing to do? If so, then that's where you want to live. If not, better hope that when hard times come, you've made enough money to take care of it for yourself and your family, because you're going to need it. Anyway, it's a long one. I may read it next hour for some of our national audience, but the snowplow test, I think, illustrates only so well. Are there snotty conservatives? Probably. I can't imagine there aren't. Are there some that are biased? Sure. But the point is, are they the ones writing columns? No, they're not. They're not writing columns even in conservative newspapers like the Washington Times. They're not Christians writing in Christianity Today or The World magazine or The Stream. But they are writing for the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. We'll be back right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just kind of give you a program note. About an hour from now, we'll have Joe Loconte on. I have posted his article, Reagan's Fight for America Renewal Revisited. And it sort of helps us understand that what should be our vision in the midst of an administration that doesn't have and share that vision, because we need to recognize what we want to do for the future. And I think he takes us back to kind of the vision of Ronald Reagan and really kind of what has made America great and what that vision should be. So I think you'll appreciate that. He is with the Heritage Foundation, and of course he's an individual that we've known over the years. Was with the Heritage Foundation, then with a university, and then came back again. So anyway, we'll spend some time with him. And just as a program note, let me mention that at 2 o'clock today, Preston Sprinkle will be with us as we talk about his book, Embodied. Many people think this may be the best book by a Christian on the subject of transgenderism. So we're going to give it an entire hour. We're going to talk about what do we mean by transgender, because there are different categories underneath that. People that maybe have gender dysphoria, others that don't have gender dysphoria. What about very quick acting gender dysphoria? What about intersex? We'll get into all of those things and a lot of detail. And I might just mention that he wrote his previous book dealing with the issue of homosexuality, interestingly enough, at the urging of a fellow gay friend who told him that he should write that book. He was finished the book. I guess he was writing it. And Preston said, well, why should I? I mean, what do we need another book about homosexuality from another straight Christian? And his gay friend said, because of all the books out there, when we read yours, we get the sense of we rather than they. There's a sense in which you kind of understand what we're dealing with. And so that's why he called that particular book, People to be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue. And so because of that, then decided, okay, maybe I should write on transgender, and again, spends a fair amount of time explaining, look, I have no understanding from an experiential point of view anything about what it's like to be transgender, to deal with gender dysphoria, to be an intersex person, whatever that might be. But I've tried to climb up the knowledge curve and have as much empathy for what individuals are dealing with. And so that's why we're going to spend an hour with him at 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock tomorrow or today, and you'll have a chance to hear that. Speaking about tomorrow, I'm already ahead of myself. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about our action alert, which in many cases relates to my Viewpoints commentary today. If you go to pointofview.net, you will see that my commentary today I've entitled Not Election Reform. And that is, there are a lot of individuals that are convinced, I think obviously so, that there were some abnormalities, irregularities, even if you don't even want to use the word fraud, with this last election, and those need to be addressed. And so I start out by saying that a number of individuals, including Senator Rand Paul, who was out the other day doing an interview, said that he was going to spend, quote, the next 2 years going around from state to state and fixing these problems. And many states, including the state of Texas, I just mentioned a minute ago, have some bills dealing with this issue of election reform. But I also say that he and other members of Congress need to spend some time in Washington, D.C., because the first bill, H.R. 1, is called For the People Act of 2021. Now, if that sounds familiar, those of you that have been receiving my Viewpoints commentary remember that last year I wrote an entire commentary on the For the People Act, and then it was subsequently passed by the House of Representatives. Went to the Senate, nothing happened there. Well, you can understand because as I will go through this, it has every, if you will, liberal progressive wish list on there that you can imagine, even some that almost make no sense, like, well, you have to actually print every one of the printed ballots through an organization that hires union workers. I mean, so it was, everything's on there. But this bill, very much like the last one, for example, instead of saying, we have some problems that maybe we need to fix, it says, no, we actually want to go even further. We want to double down on this. Here's a short list. All the states, all 50 states and the District of Columbia must have mail-in voting. All the states must have automatic registration to vote, which means you could go onto the internet and register to vote and nobody'd even see your ID. All states must have a period of early voting, which is, again, as convenient as we've talked about before with people like John Fund and Hans von Spakowski, is a place where a fair amount of misdeeds have taken place. All states must allow anyone to register the same day of the election. You can walk in, not even be registered to vote, and say, I want to register right now, and then I want to vote. What possibly could go wrong there? All states may not require an individual to provide any form of identification as a condition of obtaining an absentee ballot. And, of course, they also want to get rid of voter ID. And if you thought that ballot harvesting is a bad idea, and in case you forget this, we actually had to redo a congressional election in North Carolina 4 years ago because of illegal ballot harvesting, and probably should have redone some in Southern California, but that's my commentary here. It also says that here a voter may designate any person to require someone else to take their ballot to the post office, a ballot drop-off location, or an election office, that there is no limit to the number that that designated person can collect, and the only requirement is that they receive no financial remuneration for dropping those off. But, of course, there's nothing said about paying the person that voted in the first place. And so you can kind of see that this is a disaster. And so tomorrow you will see that we want to have an action alert where you can contact your member of Congress. Some of them have already signed on, but I still think you should let them know that you have concerns about H.R. 1. And if they have not or don't know how they're going to vote, they need to hear from you. And then I think there's every reason to believe that if Nancy Pelosi can really crack the whip, that this could theoretically pass the House of Representatives. It did last time, and it could again, even though the vote margins are much closer now because there are fewer Democrats under her control, but nevertheless could pass the House. If it does and goes to the Senate, then we will want you to contact your 2 United States senators. So I just wanted to give you kind of a preview of what is coming. And speaking of a preview, tomorrow I'm going to talk about the Biden regulations, very significant issues as well. Of course, we need government regulations, but the Biden administration now with its executive order has changed the whole way in which we evaluate those regulations. And that many people are both on the left and the right saying maybe one of the most significant executive orders signed by this president. And I'm sure you've only really heard about it here on Point of View. I don't think it's been covered at all by the mainstream press. I don't think it's been covered very well by conservative talk either. But just before we take a break, I wanted to get to our second article. And the reason I want to do that is because this may be the first time you hear about it. This shouldn't surprise you, but this story, and you can read it in its entirety, Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters marched through the streets of Washington, D.C. on Saturday night. You can see some of the videos. Marchers were heard saying, if we don't get it, burn it down as the march takes place. At one point, after calling for burning it down, protesters eventually did become violent with the D.C. police outside of one of those restaurants. And so, again, you can see the video done by Brendan Guchenschwager. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name. It's a good German name. And they also carried Antifa flags, and they were chanting things. Whose streets are streets? To be give some credit where credit is due, Fox News did cover it a little bit, in which they reported the Total Liberation Collective and the Palm Collective organized this particular rally that took place, and that also involved not only Black Lives Matter and some others. Now, I'm going to use some words you don't like to hear all the time, because the collective also organized what's called DC Queer and Trans Black History March and Rally. That one also was taking place there as well. And then following the events, the protesters marched near DuPont Circle. As the marchers approached all sorts of restaurants, they began to harass diners. And again, you can watch the video. But the point I'm making is, we were told that a lot of these protests and these riots were due to the fact that Donald Trump was president. Joe Biden's president, and the protests continue. But the press just never takes the time to cover those anymore, because it really doesn't fit the narrative. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Our third and final article we'll talk about this hour is written by Andrew Mikta. I have really appreciated his writing, but I always hesitate to post one of his articles because he has this vocabulary that's off the charts. And Steve, my producer, and I have been talking about some of these people that when they reach for a word, they reach for one that most of us only find in a thesaurus. And he just, he's got incredible vocabulary, but there are a couple of times when I'm just going, okay, I need to get a dictionary because I don't even know what that word means. And so it's pretty amazing, but he's got some great things to say. So I may occasionally have to translate here, but nevertheless, it's called the fracturing of the American ideal. And he says the idea of a self-constituting citizen endowed with rights and constrained by law has been indispensable in the forging of stable democratic political systems. Okay, it's a little bit much, but he's talking about the idea that we are based upon this idea that we have rights, but at the same time, those rights are limited because we expect people to do the right thing, and we also limit the power of the government. We have checks and balances and things like that. And so he says in America, these institutions were birthed with a prerequisite of a common ethnicity. And the point he's been making here is that we sort of have become a melting pot culture. And we have always recognized that there was diversity, but there was also unity. And there's a real call right now for unity, but that's not necessarily happening because instead what has been pushed forward is group identity. We've talked about this in terms of race. We've talked about it in terms of class and all the rest. And so he said each time in recent history that governments have favored group-based systemic solutions, despotism has followed, and ultimately the implosion of the state built upon it. Because you have to recognize that our country is e pluribus unum. Out of the many, we have at least some similarity, and we don't have a common core. Now, I'm not sure necessarily where he stands in terms of his Christian conviction. He doesn't say much about it, but I've always felt that one of the things that have pulled us together as a country are our Judeo-Christian foundations. Jews and Christians certainly had an agreement. Even if you weren't a Christian, you still had kind of a sense of Christian morality, and all of that has changed. So what he does begin to talk about is the oligarchization, there's one of those words again, of American elites, and the parallel pauperization of the citizenry is real but uniformly suppressed story about the nation's ongoing balkanization. Okay, I got to translate that one. What he's saying is this. You have these elites out here, and they have all the power. And then you have the rest of the people that are the paupers. And I think he made some of those words up. But nevertheless, what he's getting at is something we've talked about before. The reason the whole idea of populism is developing and has developed is populism is the feeling that ordinary people have that those people in the elite groups no longer pay attention to them. It's a little bit like the conversation we had just a few minutes ago about the snow plow test. And that is, we are starting to get this sense more and more that there's one set of rules for the elite and a different set of rules for the rest of America. We saw this during the lockdowns. The people that were telling us to not go out and be with other individuals went out and were with other individuals. The people telling us not to travel are actually telling us not to travel when they're in Cabo, Mexico. The people telling us not to go get their hair done are the ones getting their hair done. You know what I'm talking about here. And so what he's saying is that this has really become such a problem because we have the elites living in one world and the rest of America living in a different world. And then he goes on to say it's even worse than it used to be because we used to have this massive middle class. But he said before the pandemic hit, almost a third of all Americans lived in lower class households with a median income of just $25,000 a year, less than 2/3 of the national median. But now when you look at this, what has happened is a lot of people, even in the middle class, have ended up in the lower class. Some people in the middle class, because they've been tied into these jobs where they can telecommute, have done a lot better. And so whereas before, I'm going to put this with my hands, you had kind of this middle class, you got the more and more separating of the upper class and the lower class, and the middle class simply isn't there any longer. And he goes on to point out that the fading of the middle class has also been a byproduct of the corporate offshoring of our industry. That's one of the reasons why many people think Donald Trump won 4.5 years ago, because when he said, You know, we sent too many jobs to China. We need to see if we can bring them back. And you had people like Barack Obama and even Joe Biden at the time saying, yeah, they're not going to come back. Well, they did under Donald Trump in part. And, of course, that wasn't something that is going to probably happen in the future. But it's a good illustration of why he says that we are moving away from this sort of American ideal of each person having rights, each person having due process, each individual having the opportunity to pursue the American dream. And he's not overplaying this because we recognize that we still have some incredible success stories, but it has gone from bad to worse in part because of the lockdowns and because of the pandemic. And it's also been reinforced by so many different things that have unfolded just in the last couple of weeks. And an example I used the other day, and I have as one of my examples that will come up next week in one of my Viewpoints commentaries, is what happened when we saw those individuals who are kind of average investors deciding to buy GameStop stock and hurt some of the elite Wall Street hedge funds. And as soon as they started doing that, you had a digital distribution platform that banned their account. You had another, that's Robinhood, locking them out of their online trading accounts, and all of it seemed coordinated to actually help the hedge fund. And one of the commentaries I read just recently was pointing out that it seemed almost like something we saw earlier in which Google, Apple, and Amazon were able to deplatform Parler. And the justification for banning the account of these investors was they engaged in hate speech. And the argument was, why did we deplatform Parler? Well, they allowed hate speech on there, as if it isn't showing up in every other particular social media account. And so then you think, okay, well, we'd certainly want to hear from the Biden administration about what's happening right now in Wall Street. And when the White House press corps asked the press secretary for a response from the Biden administration, what did you get? Well, we're thrilled that Janet Yellen has become the first female Treasury Secretary. Not exactly an answer to the question, was it? And one individual decided to have a little fun at the expense of the press secretary and Janet Yellen. And his headline was, in historic first, Janet Yellen becomes first female Treasury Secretary to request ethics waiver for Wall Street speaking fees. Because as I've documented on this, she received almost $1 million, that's about $800,000 so far that we know of, in speaking fees from Citadel. Might say, what's Citadel? Oh, Citadel's the hedge fund connected to the whole GameStop saga. And so you can understand why more and more individuals are just saying it really does seem like the elites play by a different set of rules than the rest of us. And as this very good article by Andrew Michta points out, the ideal of everyone having a place at the table, the ideal, which oftentimes was violated by discrimination and all sorts of other things, but the ideal is being fractured. And this is why I don't think populism is going away, even if Donald Trump's not on the national stage. Anyway, we'll take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. Hope you had a great weekend. And matter of fact, you probably watched the Super Bowl, or at least heard about the fact that Tom Brady won again, and now he has won more Super Bowls than any NFL team. And so that, again, congratulations to our listeners out there in the Tampa Bay area or anywhere around the country where they have been rooting for him, even when he, of course, was with New England. Maybe there were some people in New England rooting for him as well. So that is the case, and the score was so significant that I don't think we're going to need a recount. I don't think we're going to have an audit or anything like that. I think we'll probably, just had to have a little fun with that for a second. Our friends at Babylon Bee, even at halftime, said unexpectedly all sorts of points were given automatically and found for the Kansas City Chiefs. They were having fun, of course, with the election. But I want to get into some issues, but just before we do so, let me just mention at the bottom of the hour, we're going to have our friend Joe Loconte with us, and we'll be talking about Reagan's fight for America Renewal Revisited. I thought it was a very good piece that came out a while ago, but I wanted you to hear from him. One, because he reminded us of what it was like when Ronald Reagan came into power in 1981, what he said at the inauguration, and if nothing else, for some of you that are younger, my, how things have changed. And so I think you will benefit from some of the material he'll share with us. And it's one of the articles we've posted so that you can read it in its entirety. Then at the 2 o'clock hour, we have Preston Sprinkle with us. His book is entitled Embodied. He is a biblical scholar and a Christian that has, by many people's accounts, done perhaps the best job of writing about issues like homosexuality and transgenderism. When he was going to finish his book on people to be loved, why homosexuality is not just an issue, he began to wonder, should I really even write about homosexuality? What do we need? Another book by a straight guy talking about homosexuality? And his gay friend said, well, the reason we want you to write it is because we feel like you understand what we're dealing with and you have such empathy. So he did, and then, of course, immediately concluded that when the book came out, it was a little too late because then the issue moved on to transgenderism. And so we're going to get into that with his new book, and that book just came out. And really, we'll get into all the aspects of what transgender means. So I'll give you a parental warning. We'll be talking about sex, obviously, but not in an explicit way. But what does it mean when we talk about gender dysphoria? What about individuals that call themselves transgender but don't have gender dysphoria? What about intersex? That's a whole chapter in the book. What about rapid onset gender dysphoria? Something we've talked about before with some other experts. We will get into all of that in quite a bit of detail, and that will be taking place an hour from now. But let me, if I can, go to a couple of the articles. And one of those, interestingly enough, that I've posted, I found when I was watching Super Bowl. And I tend to sometimes go through Twitter just to see what people are saying about the game, about some of the woke commercials, about halftime, whatever. And interesting enough, Brett Hume actually quoted this one, and it's by our friend Rod Dreyer, called the snowplow test. And so just in the few minutes, it's 5 pages, but we won't go to all of it. He points out this column that came out from a columnist who writes for the Los Angeles Times, but Virginia Heffernan actually lives in Brooklyn Heights, out in a little bit more of a rural community, and she had a problem. That is, her neighbors who are Trump supporters, plowed her driveway without being asked and did a great job of it. And she's now facing this major dilemma because these Trump-loving neighbors did something nice for her, and she doesn't know what the right thing to do about it is. And Rod Dreher says, well, now stop right there. You know, normal people don't have this problem. Normal people think, oh, how nice, and start thinking of ways to return the kindness. But that's not how a normal person would react. But this is exactly how a Harvard-educated, New York-based liberal journalist would react, who says, you know, the Trumpites next door to our pandemic getaway seem to be devoted to our ex-president, and yet they plowed our driveway without being asked and did a great job. How am I going to resist demands for unity in the face of an act of such aggressive niceness? You know, she says at some level, I guess I owe them thanks, but, you know, I'm not exactly ready to bring over a covered dish to thank them or anything like that. This is kind of weird because back in the city, New York City, she means, people don't sweep other people's walkways for nothing. And Rod Dreher says, you know, it kind of takes a New Yorker to be confronted with someone doing something nice for them and then be suspicious about it. So then she remembers, you know, after the January 6th attack on the Capitol, I remember that Senator Ben Sasse issued an aw shucks plea for all Americans to love their neighbors. The United States, he says, isn't Hatfield's and McCoy's, this blood feud forever. He added, you know, if nothing else, you should maybe plow somebody's driveway because you can't hate someone who shovels your driveway. And so she then says, well, maybe my neighbor heard Ben Sasse. And then she goes on to say, well, even so, you know, I can't give my neighbors absolution. It's not mine to give. Free driveway work, as nice as it is not the same currency as justice and truth. And to pretend that would be a lie, and they probably aren't looking for absolution anyway. At this point, Rod Dreher puts facepalm. It's just like, I can't even believe this. But he finally then says, let me tell you something, Virginia. Your neighbors probably have no idea who Ben Sasse is. They aren't looking for trying to reconcile with you, much less receive your absolution. They just wanted to do something nice for you because you are their neighbor, and that's what neighbors do for each other. The fact that you assume that there must be some politically aware motive behind the action says a lot about you. I grew up in the rural South, he says, and trust me, nobody stopped to ask what one's politics were before doing something nice for them. This is not how people live outside of blue state consciousness. He says, as for absolution, I kind of hope that you do try to engage your Trumpist neighbors by descending from on high to tell them that you have been willing to wash their sins away from the pure milk of liberal kindness. That would be fun to watch, he says. Your neighbors know perfectly well that you hate Trump, but they're like normal people. They don't care. You're their neighbor. Your driveway needs plowing. Didn't occur to them to think that they needed to know something else about you. Honestly, this is the kind of MAGA heads in the mist that take a call for you. Maybe put on Sweet Home Alabama, blast it at top value, and stop buying into some of these liberal hypocrisy. And so then he then tells all sorts of stories. Rod Dreher talks about a Latino immigrant who is in this Louisiana town, and he talks about playing poker with some of these individuals. And Rod Dreher, being originally from Louisiana, remembers one of the names that he heard, and this guy was the leader of the Ku Klux Klan. And yet he asked the Latino about that, and he said, oh, yeah, he's really not a bad guy once you get to know him. And so here in a small town, you got this Latino immigrant playing poker with a former member of the Ku Klux Klan. But he says, you know, that's small town life for you. It's where people don't ask what your political affiliation is. They simply do the right things and try to help you. He then talks about some others in another town dealing with a gay couple, and a lot of people probably didn't agree with homosexuality, but they did the right thing for the man had AIDS. It's a great piece. If nothing else, it's what he calls the snowplow test, and I encourage you to read it in its entirety. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Recent surveys show that millions of Americans doubt that the 2020 elections will run fairly. That is why a number of state legislators are filing bills and considering what changes need to be made before the next election cycle. In fact, Senator Rand Paul announced on one TV program that he will be spending the next 2 years going around from state to state and fixing these problems. He and other members of Congress might also spend a significant amount of their time in Washington trying to fix a bill that will likely pass the House and could even pass the Senate. The Democracy Restoration Act of 2021 is H.R. 1, meaning it is the first bill in Congress. It is similar to the For the People Act I discussed last year and was passed by the House of Representatives. Instead of trying to address some of the concerns millions of voters have with the way the 2020 elections were run, the bill attempts to go even further in the wrong direction. The bill essentially requires states to do away with nearly all election rules that exist to prevent election fraud. All states must have mail-in voting. All states must have automatic registration to vote. All states must have a period of early voting. All states must allow anyone to register the same day as an election. The state may not require an individual to provide any form of identification as a condition of obtaining an absentee ballot. The bill vastly expands ballot harvesting. It says that a voter can designate any person to return a voted and sealed absentee ballot to the post office, a ballot drop-off location, tribally designated building, or election office. There's much more in the bill, but you can see just from these few examples that this isn't election reform. It's a prescription for more problems in the next election. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to find some of the articles we've been talking about today, they are on the website, pointofview.net. Bottom of the hour, we're going to be talking with our good friend Joe Loconte, Dr. Joe Loconte. I guess I should give him his formal title as an individual that has written quite a number of books, but also has written this one about Reagan's fight for American renewal. But just before we do that, right now, if you were listening on your computer, you might have heard my Viewpoints commentary today, which is entitled Not Election Reform. I wanted to bring it up for just a minute because tomorrow we're going to give you an action alert. My commentary today is about H.R. 1. That is a piece of legislation that is in front of the Congress. It's called the For the People Act of 2021. Now, if that sounds familiar, yes, last year at about this time, I did a commentary on the For the People Act. This one is virtually identical to that one last year. And last year it passed the House of Representatives, went to the Senate. Of course, didn't go anywhere that time, but this time we have a different United States Senate. And this is an attempt to take some of the various innovative and maybe questionable actions during this last election and institutionalize them nationwide. If you are one of those many individuals that believe there were some election irregularities last year, then you are not alone, and it is one of those things that is now being addressed in many state legislatures. I open the piece by talking about the fact that Senator Rand Paul announced on one TV program, it was an ABC news program, that he'd be spending the next 2 years going around from state to state and trying to fix some of these problems. But then I go on to say, well, he and some of the members of Congress might also want to try to fix some of the problems with this piece of legislation right there in Congress, because this is an attempt to, instead of say, maybe what we did in 2020 wasn't such a good idea, this is an attempt to, if you will, double down and even extend it more. We're going to encourage you to contact tomorrow when we put up our action alert, contact your member of Congress, because if you want to read the legislation, you can, but we'll give you a quick summary. What it basically says is all states must have mail-in voting, all 50 states and the District of Columbia. All states must have automatic registration to vote, which means you could register to vote on the internet without even showing any ID. All states must have a period of early voting. As much as we love early voting, and it's very convenient, we've had on this program people like John Funn, Hans von Spakowski, and others talking about that's one of the places where there have been significant voting irregularities and fraud. Also, all states must allow anyone to register the same day as an election. Oh, what could possibly go wrong? We'll come in here and register right then and then go and vote. And we don't know anything about you other than what you actually produce at that particular point. As a matter of fact, a state, and this is now directly quoting from the law, may not require an individual to provide any form of identification as a condition of obtaining an absentee ballot. Ballot harvesting is something we've talked about on this program before. It resulted in having to actually hold a new election in Congress 4 years ago in North Carolina because of ballot harvesting illegally. I think it should have been done in other states as well. And again, it says that a voter can designate any person to return a voted and sealed absentee ballot to the post office, a ballot drop-off location, tribally designated building, or election office. The only requirement is that the person you designate cannot receive any remuneration for it. Doesn't mean that you couldn't pay someone else, but this is why we're going to spend some time tomorrow encouraging you to contact your member of Congress, because last time this bill passed the House, it may not this time because of the tighter, if you will, difference between Republicans and Democrats. There are fewer Democrats under control of Nancy Pelosi, but who knows? It could pass the House, and if it does, then we'll encourage you to contact your senators, because it is something that we are greatly concerned about, and you should be concerned about as well. Well, that will be tomorrow, and my Viewpoints commentary is something you can read today to kind of get ready for it. Let me also go to our second article just to simply point out that there are very few news outlets that have pointed out something that happened over the weekend. I'm reading from now. Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters marched through the streets of Washington, D.C. on Saturday night. You can watch one of the videos there where marchers can be heard chanting, "If we don't get it, burn it down." Burn it down was something that then led to a conflict, and a violent conflict, between the D.C. police outside of a restaurant. These were individuals who took to the streets in the nation's capital. They were carrying Antifa flags, could be seen with the marchers chanting such things as "Whose streets? Our streets." So, again, a lot of that was taking place. Now, again, I will give partial credit because Fox News did cover it briefly, but I imagine most of you are probably hearing about this for the very first time. Fox News did report that what was called the Total Liberation Collective and Palm Collective organized now, again, I'm going to use a word I don't like using, but this is what they were called, the D.C. Queer and Trans Black History March and Rally, which then began to develop into some other areas. They were actually at one point meeting in a recreation center. Following that event, Black Lives Matter protests and others marched near DuPont Circle. As the marchers approached a lot of these restaurants, the protesters began to harass diners, and that's when the D.C. police tried to form lines around the diners. And if you want to read more about that, it is our second article, and I bring it up simply to point out that, first of all, you probably have not heard about that, and there's a very good reason for that, and that is it doesn't fit the narrative. Remember, the narrative before is the reason people are protesting all over the country, first in Minneapolis and other places, was because of the death of George Floyd. Okay, we understand that. But eventually the protests were about Donald Trump being in office. Well, if you've paid any attention, Donald Trump is not in office. Joe Biden is in office. And these protests in many places have still continued. This one in D.C., you of course, can read about others in Portland and other places. And again, it is just an illustration of the need for you to read a little widely and not just depend on one news source, even this one as your news source. Find other sources, because you will find out that some of these stories just simply don't get covered at all. Before we take a break, the third article I was just going to mention briefly. It's written by Andrew Mikta. He's an incredible writer, but he does tend to use, what do they call them, 50-cent words? You know, he tends to have words that he uses that sometimes you almost need to find a dictionary or a thesaurus to figure out what he means. But the title of it is The Fracturing of the American Ideal. And he points out early on that we've had as a country an ideal that we are endowed with rights. We as Christians would say we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that we're constrained by law. And so as a result, those institutions give us checks and balances to protect us from individuals that have too much power, and we also recognize we have rights. But then he points out in his third paragraph that each time in recent history when governments instead have favored group-based solutions, group-based systemic solutions, wanting to divide by race, by class, whatever, then he says despotism, or we could even say totalitarianism, has followed and ultimately has led to the implosion of the state which was built upon it. And he points to, and he uses some big words here, but what he's talking about here is the fact that we sort of have this developed oligarchy out here of the elite. And then we have the paupers down here, the rest of America. And that is something which is getting more and more of concern, because we have the haves and the have-nots. We have the oligarchs. We have the elites. For example, telling you that you cannot go out during a lockdown, and then they go out during a lockdown. You cannot meet with people and have dinner, but they're meeting with people and having dinner. You cannot get your hair done, but they're getting their hair done. And more recently, of course, I talked about the interesting contrast between the sort of average group of investors who decided to buy stock of GameStop in order to hurt some of these elites in the Wall Street hedge funds. And what happened? Oh, well, that was a digital distribution platform banned their account. You had an online trading account, Robinhood, that locked them out. And as a result, it reminded a lot of people of what happened when Google and Apple and Amazon decided to deplatform Parler, when Twitter and Facebook decided to pull the New York Post story. And so this article, I think, reminds us that we are moving very quickly from this American ideal, which we're going to talk about in just a minute with Joe Loconte, into an elite oligarchs and the rest of us. And no wonder the whole idea of populism is still quite current. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we are going to bring to the microphone an individual who's been on the program with us many times before, Dr. Joe Loconte, director of the Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to that, served as well as associate professor of history at King's College, and an individual that was with the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a variety of other organizations that we can talk about. Has been somebody that we've called on from time to time here on the Point of View program, and it is a delight to bring him back to the microphone today as we talk about a piece that he published a while back, which has the title Reagan's Fight for American Renewal Revised and Revisited. So if nothing else, Dr. Joe Loconte, great to have you on the program with us.
Kerby, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Let's, if we can, bring people back to 1981. I wanted to do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was a reminder of what it was like back then. We have so many young listeners that were not around in the 1980s, to put it mildly, or even if they were adults, probably weren't paying attention. And so in some respects, going back 40 years really helps you understand that Ronald Reagan came into office saying, you know, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem, and then set forth a vision that you talk about in this piece.
Yeah, thank you, Kerby. You know, I'm an historian, not a political scientist or a political philosopher. What historians like to do, look at the past, try to learn what we can from the past, why things turned out the way they did, because there was nothing inevitable about Reagan's political triumphs and victories, particularly in the face of such cultural and political opposition. And I think there are lessons there for us. There are no exact historical parallels, of course, but there are lessons for us now as we struggle with a different set of cultural and political challenges. And I think now is actually a very good time to revisit that period. I know some people think, well, you're talking about Reagan, you're kind of stuck in the past, a romantic past, Reagan bromides and all the rest of it. I think they've got it exactly wrong. I think it really bears serious scrutiny now in understanding how did Ronald Reagan manage to turn around a moribund economy and ultimately defeat the Soviet Union peacefully, end the Cold War peacefully. If you're not interested in those questions, then it seems you have a complete lack of intellectual curiosity. That'd be one place to start, Kerby, right?
Well, and again, let's just, for our younger audience, paint the picture for a minute. They had a misery index back then. Jimmy Carter had been the president. You had Americans held hostage. You had high inflation, high interest, all sorts of issues. You had Soviets in Afghanistan. This was a country that was exhausted after Vietnam and Watergate. So he had, people think, oh, he had it easy. No, he actually came in at a very crucial time and had to turn a lot around simultaneously, didn't he?
Yes, Kerby. It was a time of incredible self-doubt and self-flagellation. And I remember it at two levels. I was old enough to remember it. And now as a historian studying it more carefully, it is hard to overstate the mood of gloom and disillusionment in America and outside of the United States, even our allies looking at America, and we've lost the Vietnam War, and we've lost in a terrible way. We've had a president nearly impeached for a resignation with Richard Nixon, the Watergate scandal. And as you say, an economic doldrums. It really seemed to many people that the left, the political left, the socialists, and the communists in the Soviet Union, they were on the ascendancy. And America was in decline, and that talk was in the air, particularly in the academic world, but also within our politics. So there was a mood of defeatism that Reagan went into, and he just took it head on and declared it was morning in America.
I just love that. Let's talk about this because early on in your piece, you talk about the fact that he appealed to the moral courage of free men and women, asking them to rededicate themselves to a noble purpose. It could have been that he just could have said, we're going to still have to deal with the malaise of Jimmy Carter. We're just going to have to recognize that we'll just have to make our peace with the Soviet Union. And we'll just have to assume that we'll always have high taxes. And he took on all of those simultaneously, didn't he?
Yes, he really did, Kerby. And I think part of the key here, this is good for conservatives right now, Reagan believed in American exceptionalism, I think, in a way that few presidents have over the last 100 years. And by that I mean he had such an attachment to the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, federalism, the whole principle of government by consent of the governed, power to the people. There was a real populist streak in Reagan we don't quite appreciate, but it went back to his deep grounding in the Constitution, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I think that's something not only that can and must unite conservatives right now, that fundamental commitment to the Constitution, constitutional principles, but also I think it's the key to political and at least to some degree cultural renewal. How is America going to renew its political culture? Well, you have to reaffirm your commitments to the separation of powers, government by consent, equal justice under the law. That's a pretty good place to start, isn't it?
Yes. Well, and again, let's get into that whole issue. We did quote briefly from Andrew Mikta on the fracturing of the American ideal, but you talk about that in one of your pieces because he was looking ahead to the possibility that we might have identity politics and tribalism, but instead said all of us together in and out of government must bear the burden. The solutions we seek must be equitable, that no one group be singled out to pay a higher price. So in some respects, that's just the antithesis, just the opposite of what we're hearing these days, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And it's hard to know how advanced it was at that moment. How advanced was the tribalistic identity group politics? It was happening. It was beginning to happen 40 years ago. So just now, fast forward 40 years now, and how intense it is, how the Democratic Party really defines itself that way. And what Reagan was saying then is that will not only divide the country, it will lead to a demoralized democracy, turning American against American. And he had a way of unifying people in a way that you really haven't seen in any political leader since. He could really speak to people across the political aisle because, again, I think he went back to these basic principles of self-government, personal responsibility, a moral compass. I think for most Americans, that's how they think of themselves. Yeah, I want to leave a decent, humane, moral life and make decisions for myself without a paternalistic state telling me what to do. That was Ronald Reagan's domestic outlook, wasn't it?
Well, and again, you talked about something else, which kind of gets into this whole idea of populism and the rest, because you say Reagan praised ordinary citizens. Let me give the quote, and then I'll get your comments. You talked about the men and women who raise our foods, patrol our streets, man our mines and factories, teach our children, keep our homes, heal us when we're sick, professionals, industrialists, shopkeepers, clerks, cabbies, and truck drivers. I've heard a few people talk like that. Donald Trump sometimes does. Senator Ben Sasse talks like that. But very few others do, because he understood that America is built on the backs of ordinary citizens doing their work day in and day out.
Yeah, and I think this is worth thinking about, Kerby. You know, he wasn't a professional politician for so much of his life, right? He was born into a poor family in a small Midwestern town. He lives through the Great Depression. He lives through the Second World War and the aftermath. He had voted Democratic for Franklin Roosevelt four times until the Democratic Party abandoned him and abandoned its principles, according to Reagan, right? So he lived a lot of life. He wasn't merely, as critics say, a B-movie actor. One of my colleagues here at the Heritage Foundation, Lee Edwards, who was with Reagan in the 1960s in a limousine, interviewing him for a book he was working on, and he asked Ronald Reagan what was he reading recently? What was he reading? This is before he ran for governor, and he said, the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers. How many politicians today in the House and the Senate at the executive level, particularly in this Biden administration, how many today would give that answer? I've just been reading the Federalist Papers. Well, the Federalist Papers are all about self-government, preserving freedom and order, reflecting on our Constitution, right?
And again, I grew up in California. My dad ran for California Assembly, and I actually have with me an autograph from the governor, Ronald Reagan, when he became governor. But I saw how, in some respects, he was doing various commentaries, radio commentaries, reading some of the foundational works, and really just trying to appeal to the American spirit. But we need to take a break. But one of the things you point out, because I thought that was significant, and I did not realize this, but again, that's why we love you historians. For the first time in American history, the inauguration event was held on the west side of the Capitol, thus facing the direction that it always symbolized the American future. Because if you're looking out there, of course, what do you see? You see the Washington Monument, you see the Jefferson Monument, you see the Lincoln Memorial, you see the reflecting pool, and all the rest. So I want to come back and talk about that and some of the things he had to say. I did not realize that up until then he was the first to do that. And of course, we have some other comments as well about really the ability not only to bring the American people together, Well, one of the challenges at that time was to bring conservatives together because you had free market economists and libertarians, you had limited government people, you had strong defense people, and that was something else that we can certainly talk about. So we are talking today with Dr. Joseph Loconte, and if you want to know more about him or the Heritage Foundation, we have all those links on the website. This article, I think eventually you can find it in a number of different formats, but we have posted one there for you to read in its entirety. And for those of you that are young and were not around during the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, going back in history a little bit, maybe to see what we need to do in the future. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. Joe Loconte. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. A very good piece, Reagan's Fight for America Renewal Revisited. And one of the things you point out near the end of your paper is for the first time in American history, the inauguration event was held on the west side of the Capitol, thus facing the direction that has always symbolized American future. You know, go west, young man, but also as he speaks, he can see the monuments to all of these individuals, whether it's the Washington Monument, Jefferson Memorial, Lincoln Memorial, or in just a minute we'll talk about Arlington National Cemetery. That is significant at a time when so many people want to tear down some of these monuments and memorials. And I think that's another aspect of that inauguration of Ronald Reagan, isn't it?
Yes, Kerby, it's an excellent point. And, you know, Reagan, this wasn't just pure nostalgia. Reagan had done a lot of homework about the American founding. He knew our history certainly better than most of the people on the political and cultural left today. He was aware of the blemishes. But at the end of the day, he knew what the United States had created was the greatest bulwark for democracy, freedom, and human rights that the world had ever seen. And those men that we honor there in the mall, and with those statues and those memorials, well, there's a reason we do that. We have to keep reminding ourselves of the tremendous debt we owe to a previous generation, the sacrifice, the blood that came before to make possible this stable, democratic, prosperous nation that we all enjoy. Reagan understood that instinctively. It was part of his commitment to American exceptionalism. So, yeah, that was very deliberate. And Reagan really embraced the moving of the ceremony to the west side of the Capitol so that everyone could be looking out and their attention could be drawn to these great heroes of democracy.
It's just incredible. One of his lines, whoever would understand in his heart the meaning of America will find it in the life of Abraham Lincoln. Well, as you know, Joe, they're tearing down Abraham Lincoln as if he was a Confederate general in the Civil War.
Yeah.
So even Abraham Lincoln isn't revered much anymore in many of our institutions of higher learning or even in some of the statues around the country.
Yeah, the radical left, which has found such a comfortable home with the Democratic Party, unfortunately, it has become emotionally unhinged. And I think Martin Luther King Jr. would be appalled at the direction that the quote-unquote civil rights movement has taken, the calls for social justice or racial justice. I think he'd be appalled. He held that rally, as we all should know, at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, for the love of God. Right, and so now we have the quote-unquote inheritors of Martin Luther King's civil rights movement ready to tear down Lincoln himself. So there is a kind of, I don't know, it's a self-destructive self-loathing. And that Reagan really despised that. And that's why he even mentioned the heroes who died in Vietnam.
There you go.
Drawing attention to those veterans. Because, the mood then in the late 1970s, right up to 1980, soldiers were coming back from Vietnam and people were spitting on them. The contempt that many Americans, especially on the left, held for our Vietnam veterans was Reagan found it just contemptible, and he pushed back against it deliberately there in the speech, which I think was really remarkable to do.
Again, what he could see from there was Arlington National Cemetery, and he says that only represents a tiny fraction of the price that has been paid for our freedom. So, of course, he started, and now almost everybody talks about Omaha Beach and Guadalcanal and Pork Chop Hill and Vietnam. It becomes kind of a litany, but he was saying it not just as a, if you will, rhetorical flourish, but he really did recognize the incredible debt that we owe to those individuals that gave the full measure to provide us the freedom that we take for granted today.
Yes, Kirby. Every great Democratic leader through the 20th century, whether it's Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher, Winston Churchill, of course, they've understood that peace can only be preserved through strength. And that means you've got to regularly honor and recall those men and women, those leaders, at the moment of crisis. They stood up for the country. They fought and died for their country. That's that healthy patriotism. I'm not talking about an unhealthy nationalism, but a healthy patriotism is something that Reagan really cultivated and reinvigorated in the United States at a time when patriotism was really out the window, and the whole concept of American exceptionalism was on the mat. It was like the ninth round. It was on the mat, and then Reagan comes into office and says, No, America is an exceptional nation, and we're going to renew ourselves. We're going to do it through a recommitment to the Constitution and the Declaration.
Well, and also that malaise affected foreign policy, which you've already talked about, peace through strength. Yes. There's kind of like, we're just always going to have détente. And Reagan said, no, I got a different philosophy. We win, they lose. And that was the case. But just before I run out of time, one other thing. He was not only somewhat of a unifier of America, and anybody doubts that, look how he won in the 1984 election. So obviously he unified in that respect, but he also unified the Republican Party at that time, because you had, and I'm old enough to remember that, but I think you're almost old enough to remember that you had the libertarians that were only worried about free market economics. You had some of the social media, moral majority types. You had some that were peace through strength. These were very different kind of people that hardly ever talked to each other. But if you think of this as three legs on a stool, on a tripod or whatever, he had all three of those and brought those individuals together in ways that I haven't seen so much since.
I think that's right, Kerby, and I think it's worth mentioning here. Whatever you think about Donald Trump's policies and his legacy and all, it is not a capacity that Trump had to bring together the various strands of the conservative movement, much less people outside the conservative movement in any significant way. And we need to ask ourselves, all right, what can we learn from that? What can we learn from the fact that Ronald Reagan, in his second run for the presidency, won 49 out of 50 states? What does that tell us? What qualities did he possess that enabled him to do that, to speak across the conservative movement and also broadly even across the American center? And I think some of those qualities, of course, a deep commitment to America, its founding principles, and, of course, his eloquence, his absolute moral eloquence, his capacity to use the English language and to deploy it in order to persuade people. The gift of persuasion is crucial in a democratic leader.
Let me just mention that it takes about 4 pages to print out. It originally appeared in National Review, but we have the link to heritage.org because I encourage you to support Heritage. Matter of fact, I just gave again to Heritage Action just the other day, so I think very highly of them and think you should support Heritage. I'm not asking you something that I'm not doing, but you might want to print this out. You might want to read it. You know what? You might want to read it to your kids or grandkids over the dinner table and remind them of what America was like. With so much cynicism today, that's kind of what it was in 1980, and Ronald Reagan turned some of that around. And if nothing else, we owe a debt of gratitude to Joe Loconte, who is with the Heritage Foundation and the work that he's done. And it is just always so great to have you on the program. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much, Kerby. Great being with you.
We are going to take a break, and then in this next hour, we're going to focus on this issue of transgender. What does that mean? We're going to define the terms. We're going to get into different aspects of that. Preston Sprinkle is with us. He is a biblical scholar. He is a New York Times best-selling author. He's really tried to do a great deal of thinking about how Christians can kind of interact on this issue. He, of course, wrote the book, People to be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not an Issue. He's written Living in a Gray World, A Christian Teen's Guide to Homosexuality, and also the general editor of something that Zondervan put out, Two Views on Homosexuality, the Bible, and the Church. And so he's been thinking about this for some time. He's really done the research to help us with this issue of transgender. So we're going to spend some time getting into that. And if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to do so. But if you'd like to find out more about his book, it just came out. Might not be able to find it in your local bookstore just yet, but again, you can find it on our website because we've given you an opportunity to click on that button and get it either in paperback or Kindle. And if you are dealing with this either personally or maybe in your church, or you want to just understand more of this particular issue of transgender, we're going to spend an entire hour with him on that. Let's take a break. You can find all of the material we're talking about today on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. This hour, we're going to focus our time and attention on the transgender issue. This new book has just come out, Embodied, Transgender Identities in the Church and What the Bible Has to Say. Now, we've talked about this before. We've even gone into some depth talking about rapid onset gender dysphoria. We've talked about gender dysphoria, non-gender dysphoria. We'll get into some of that, as well as maybe even the idea of intersex, which is one of the chapters in this book, so we're going to try to address that. We've sometimes talked about different issues of brain states, neuroplasticity, and so we're going to cover a lot of this. Obviously, since we're talking about sexual issues, again, just a parental advisory because of the conversation we're going to have here today, but I think you're going to find this book very helpful. We have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. You can get it in paperback or Kindle. Since it's just out, it may not be in the bookstores just yet, but if you want to look for it there first, I would encourage you to do so. And Dr. Preston Sprinkle is the author of this, a biblical scholar and an author that you may know from his book, People to be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue. Also, for those of you that maybe have teenagers living in a gray world, a Christian Teen's Guide to Homosexuality. Also served as the general editor of Two Views on Homosexuality, the Bible, and the Church. So we have a couple of different topics that we can address. But first of all, Preston, it is a delight to have you on the program.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Kerby. I'm really honored.
We have mentioned you before, and I might just mention some of the people that endorse you. Scott Sauls, who's been on the program. Of course, Sean McDowell. I think some people may have even seen some of the interviews he's done with you. Scott Ray's been on the program with us, and a variety of other individuals that have endorsed your book. But I thought we'd start by me having you tell the story I've told about you before you came on the air, and that is you were with a gay friend, and he was encouraging you to finish your book, which is the book that many of us know, People to be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not an Issue. And I think at the time, you know, you were saying, well, I don't know if we need another straight Christian writing about homosexuality. And what he said is, you're actually trying to see us as you talk about us. It feels like you're talking with us. And so in some respects, his encouragement to you to write the earlier book also led to eventually, after that book came out, it was almost the day after we had the, if you will, so-called legalization of same-sex marriage, we started to hear more and more about transgender issues. But your goal, I think, Preston, has always been to try to be fair and really represent the issue and the people that you're writing about in your books. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, you have the two greatest commandments, love God and love others. And so part of loving God is to examine the scriptures, to come to the best understanding as we can of what God has revealed about himself, the world, and ourselves through the word of God. And that's part of loving God, is to love what God has said about us in the world. And we also need to love people well, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And even Jesus even says, love our enemies, you know. And so how we go about this conversation, it does need to be true to the scriptures, but also needs to be very loving. And yeah, to be honest, I mean, when it comes to questions about sexuality and gender, I mean, gosh, it can be really hard to do both well, to love God well, to honor the word of God, but also to love people well too. And so that's my goal whenever I approach this conversation, and really any hot button issue is to really, listen hard and make sure I understand another viewpoint before I even seek to, address it or even, refute it. And just to make sure that I'm honoring God and loving others in the process. So, yeah.
Well, let's get into the definitions, which are key. And one of those is the word transgender. And I love the way you structured this book, because under this huge umbrella called transgender are different subgroups, which actually are different chapters in your book. So kind of before, I think everybody thinks they know what transgender is until they start reading your book and they realize, maybe I don't understand what that is. Can you help us out there?
Yeah, that's a great starting point. And, that it ended up being almost a whole chapter where I just talk about the diversity of the trans identity or trans experience. And that's unlike, if somebody says they're same-sex attracted or they're gay, that basically means, what it sounds like it means. They're attracted to the same sex, not the opposite sex. It's not, it's not that. There's not a whole lot of diversity in terms of what it means to, have a same-sex attraction. But when it comes to being trans, I mean, you can, a psychologist friend of mine, Mark Yarhouse, likes to say, if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person, like one person's experience, or even the meaning behind that identity can mean something very different from one trans person to another trans person. So, for instance, I have a friend who experiences a psychological condition. It's now called gender dysphoria. It's unchosen, it's unwanted, it can be really debilitating. And my friend is a biological female and identifies as a biological female, but she uses the term trans as like a synonym for her experience with gender dysphoria. That would be one way somebody could use the term trans. Another friend of mine, who he would say he really does believe he was born in the wrong body, if you want to use that phrase. And so for him, when he says he's trans, he really does believe he is a woman, even though biologically he's male. So those are two very different uses of the term trans, and there's all kinds of different variations in between. So I like to tell people, if you meet a trans person, all you know about that person is that they say they're trans, but that term can mean many, many different things to different people.
And the example I sometimes use is if you have maybe gone through a class on world religions and they tell you about Buddhism, it's the same kind of thing, because you meet very different kind of Buddhists. And so the first thing you need to do, even if you're doing apologetics, is to just listen to figure out what they mean, because there are different strains of Buddhism. It means different things to different people. And of course, we haven't even talked about, but I did mention just in passing, the issue of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which there have been books written about that. Penna Dexter's done commentaries about that, and we've talked about those issues as well. So those are some big and important issues, and one of the things you try to do is listen well. You've got a section there about listening love, because to listen is to love, and that doesn't necessarily mean you always agree with what you hear, but I think we're going to really have to spend some time listening, and we want to listen to what you've been able to pull together. So let me just mention that there's 9 chapters in the book before an interlude, and then there's another 3 chapters, and then there's a conclusion and even an appendix. So there is a lot in this 280-page book. We will do our best to cover bits and pieces as we go along, but let me take a break, and when we come back, let's just focus first of all on kind of, okay, what does it mean to be male and female in the image of God? A very important kind of foundational chapter biblically. And then we'll talk about some of these issues of gender stereotypes and some of the other questions that naturally face that. Later on, we'll get into some other really difficult questions about, am I a male in a female body or a female in a male body? There's just a lot to cover, and we will do our best to cover all of it right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Recent surveys show that millions of Americans doubt that the 2020 elections will run fairly. That is why a number of state legislators are filing bills and considering what changes need to be made before the next election cycle. In fact, Senator Rand Paul announced on one TV program that he will be spending the next 2 years going around from state to state and fixing these problems. He and other members of Congress might also spend a significant amount of their time in Washington trying to fix a bill that will likely pass the House and could even pass the Senate. The Democracy Restoration Act of 2021 is H.R. 1, meaning it is the first bill in Congress. It is similar to the For the People Act I discussed last year and was passed by the House of Representatives. Instead of trying to address some of the concerns millions of voters have with the way the 2020 elections were run, the bill attempts to go even further in the wrong direction. The bill essentially requires states to do away with nearly all election rules that exist to prevent election fraud. All states must have mail-in voting. All states must have automatic registration to vote. All states must have a period of early voting. All states must allow anyone to register the same day as an election. The state may not require an individual to provide any form of identification as a condition of obtaining an absentee ballot. The bill vastly expands ballot harvesting. It says that a voter can designate any person to return a voted and sealed absentee ballot to the post office, a ballot drop-off location, tribally designated building, or election office. There's much more in the bill, but you can see just from these few examples that this isn't election reform. It's a prescription for more problems in the next election. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Preston Sprinkle. The article and the book is entitled Embodied Transgender Identities, the Church and What the Bible Has to Say. And I thought we might, Preston, spend some time just talking about, as you do in one of your chapters, male and female in the image of God. That's going to be our kind of foundation to think about some of these issues. And it's a relatively short chapter, but I thought it would be good to have that as a foundation for all the rest of the conversation we're going to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some people say, well, the Bible doesn't have anything to say about transgender identities, or maybe there's that cross-dressing prohibition that's not, that we can't apply to today. But actually, the Bible has a lot to say about what it means to be human. And there's not a scholar on earth who would disagree with the fact that Genesis 1:27, in terms of what the Bible says about human nature, is the fundamental starting point, that we are created in the image of God. This is a fundamental component of what it means to be human according to a biblical worldview. What's interesting, though, is that in that verse, it says, it doesn't just say that we're created in God's image. It says male and female, he created them.
Yes. And
there's a kind of a poetic association there between the terms male and female and being created in God's image, so that our male and female, our sex embodiment, is part of what it means to bear God's image in the world. So our sex bodies, being male and female, is really an important part of this conversation and a super important part of a biblical worldview. So that has to be our starting point.
And again, you talk about such issues as, of course, the male and female in Genesis 1 are categories of sex, not gender. And I want to come back to that in just a minute. Adam and Eve's bodies are viewed as sacred. Even the issue of Jesus viewing Genesis 1 and 2 as normative. And then even the Apostle Paul sees the body as significant for moral behavior and correlates the body with personhood. So there are just a lot of issues there that need to be addressed. But since you did talk about that briefly, there is a section there on Scripture prohibits cross-sex behavior. How do we think through that? Because that's in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 22. Some people say, well, okay, we're in the New Covenant, so that doesn't matter. But then you take us to 1 Corinthians 6. So help us sort through that issue that sometimes gets confused as well.
Yeah, that one's tricky because it's the cross-dressing prohibition in Deuteronomy 22:5 is the one command in the Old Testament. It's surrounded by a bunch of commands that I don't know any Christian that says that those commands are for today. And there's also the cultural issue of clothing. Different types of clothing change from culture to culture, and so there's a cultural issue going on there. But in my humble interpretation of that passage, I think it's not primarily about the kind of fabric that is covering your skin. It is trying to present in a deceitful way as the opposite sex. And in the Old Testament context, there were clear clothing distinctions between male and female. In fact, there were clear clothing distinctions between slave and free, or between the wealthy and the poor. Like your social kind of status was manifested in how you dress, and that went all the way down to your male or female sex identity. So, there were clear distinctions of male and female dress. Now, where this gets a little difficult is in the West. In our culture, it can be a bit blurrier. It's not like every female needs to wear a dress and every male should wear blue jeans or whatever. Like, there is some crossover there, and yet there are also some clear distinctions of what constitutes male and female dress. But again, it's not primarily about the fabric that's clinging to your skin. It's about a heart issue of, are you trying to present yourself in society as the opposite sex? And that is something that we see not just in Deuteronomy, that's something we see prohibited, not just in Deuteronomy 22, but even Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 talks about this. In the church wants people to maintain their male and female sex identities. And as you mentioned, 1 Corinthians 6, Paul, when he's talking about sexual immorality, he makes it an issue of the body. And so our sexed bodies are not simply a morally neutral canvas that we can kind of do what we want to do with them. So the biblical view of the body, is very, it's very important for this conversation. It doesn't, a Judeo-Christian view of human nature doesn't view the body, the sex body, as an insignificant part of human identity.
Sure. Well, again, we've kind of given a little bit of the biblical idea and even an admonition not to pull one verse out and use it. But let's now go into the world in which you have a chapter called 10,000 Genders, and the distinction that is made between sex and gender. There was a time not so long ago when I oftentimes use those words interchangeably. I don't do that anymore, as you might imagine, but it's a good illustration, if nothing else, about the need for us to understand that the word gender has been redefined in some pretty significant ways, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I would say this is probably the starting point of anybody that wants to engage this conversation, to understand it better, or even if their son or daughter, comes out as trans, or their neighbor comes out as trans. The most important thing is understand how the terms sex and gender are used in most cases today. So up until the 1970s, sex and gender were basically synonyms. You can say, if you said you're male, that's your sex, it's also your gender. You can use those terms interchangeably. But nowadays, at least in academic circles, and it's becoming more widespread in pop culture, sex refers to your biological sex, whether you're a male or female. And you mentioned intersex, we can get to that later. But gender is now used to describe the psychological and social and cultural aspects of being male or female. You can almost shorthand gender with like masculinity and femininity. You do have male and female as sex categories, but you also have these concepts that are very culturally shaped called masculinity and femininity. So if a person is, very emotional and is crying or, whatever, maybe they're very artistic or something, those would be stereotypically, feminine traits. If somebody is very athletic, very analytical, or, not very emotional or whatever, then somebody would assume that those are more masculine traits. So yeah, those, masculinity and femininity is more in the category of gender. Now, the biggest question is, okay, so if somebody's sex conflicts with their quote unquote gender, then which one are they? If somebody is biologically male and they're clearly male, but maybe their internal sense of who they are is not, maybe they don't identify with that reality of their biological sex, then which one are they? Does their body win out, or does the internal sense win out? And that's the crux of the debate, really. And I think given what I've surveyed in Scripture, I would say that your biology determines whether you're male or female, even if it conflicts with your internal sense of who you are.
Just before we take a break, let's talk about those stereotypes for just a minute, because one of my colleagues, Sue Boland, has talked about the fact that when you try to identify gender stereotypes, there's an overlap. I think you even gave yourself a test here in which you were partially female, partially male, and there's an understanding that those are many times culturally determined. But in some respects, what happens is that if you don't fit the typical masculine view, then they'll say, oh, well, then you must be, and of course they use some words we won't use on the air, and maybe sometimes even drives individuals into an alternative sexual orientation or to a trans attempt, or maybe even think about whether or not they should get medical interventions and a sex reassignment surgery. So in some respects, we have to make some distinctions between the stereotypes that are out there, which sometimes vary from culture to culture, and the reality of male and female. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the stereotypes, I try to use the term stereotype not in a negative way, but in a neutral way. So most biological males will act in stereotypically masculine ways. And there's biological reasons for that. I mean, high levels of testosterone does something to the way you think, the way you act, and same thing in females. Most females will naturally resonate with more feminine kinds of behavior and interest. But those are generalities. And this is the main point I want to make in that chapter is that these are generalities. Some females they don't like wearing dresses. They don't like wearing long hair. They want to, go get a job, and they're ambitious and want to, not just go get a job, climb the corporate ladder, whatever. Things that many people would see as only something that masculine people should do. But there's, I don't know what the percentage, 20 to 40% maybe of each category that may not naturally resonate with these stereotypes. And as a Christian, we need to also acknowledge that we're not commanded into these stereotypes. Even if most men will act in masculine ways, if you don't, you're still a man. You're still male. We're called to be godly. We're called to be loving. We're called to be courageous. But we're not commanded to be culturally masculine or feminine.
Well said. We need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some other issues here. We know a little bit more from brain studies. We'll talk about this idea of intersex and a number of other topics. It's all part of Embodied, Transgender Identities, the Church, and what the Bible has to say. We'll be right back.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yeah, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue your conversation with Dr. Preston Sprinkle, and his book is entitled Embodied: Transgender Identities, the Church, and What the Bible Has to Say. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Although I suspect you may just want to sit back and listen and learn from all that he has been able to put together in this book of about 280 pages. But I thought we might focus on the two issues: the male brain in a female body, the female soul in a male body. especially that first part, because you have Sonny and Cher's son, born a girl, now a boy, Chaz Bono, who actually said that even though I was born female, he says I've had a male brain. And so in some respects, that kind of gets into this whole idea of brain studies and neuroplasticity. There's a lot there, but can you kind of sort that out for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, I'll try to do my best in a short amount of time, because it's a really complicated scientific conversation. There's been over 10,000 studies done on how sex is related to the brain. So we're entering into a massive field. So yeah, there's one theory that says that, that males, that the brain is sexed like the body is. Okay. So you have a male body, a female body, and some people say the brain is also sexed. You have male brains that are categorically different than female brains. And, if you believe in the fall, some kind of, fallen human nature, then it's theoretically possible that things could get mixed up, that a male person could be born with a female brain. There's a couple problems with that. First of all, the studies that have been done on the sex of the brain are pretty mixed. Some people say, yes, the male brain is quite different than the female brain. Other studies show that they're very, very similar, and that it's really our behavior. You mentioned neuroplasticity, that sometimes our behavior will affect the very shape and structure of our brain. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg situation. If somebody seems like they have more of a female brain, then is that because they were acting in more female ways, or because their brain made them act in more female ways? And there's, again, debates about that. The one thing that isn't that disputed is that when we even talk about, male and female and the brain, we're once again talking about generality. It really goes back to, it's very similar to our conversation about stereotypes. Like, yes, most men will act in a certain way, but some don't. And same thing, most male brains, they look and seem a certain way. And if you put them through an MRI scan, they'll light up in the same way that most males will. But that's a generality. It's not an absolute.
Very true. Yeah.
So, we do know that the male and female body is sexed in dimorphic ways. Like, they are categorically different. Not to say there's no, similarities between men and women. Obviously there are, but in terms of our maleness or femaleness, we're dealing with two different sex categories. But the brain is simply not sexed in the same way the body is. So you can have a male that resonates, once again, with more feminine stereotypes, but those stereotypes don't determine whether you're a man or a woman.
Yes. Well, and again, even in your interlude, you talk about speaking on campus at Biola and having a conversation with some of the various students that are LGBTQ, and then even having a trans person saying, I was actually impressed that you humanized my situation and I felt loved and cared, because a lot of this has to do with love, and also the fact that we, as you just pointed out a minute ago, we live in a fallen world. There are children that are born with genetic issues, with the issues of their brain. We have ministries for young people that, for one way or another, have special needs. So there's a sense in which you have to have compassion in a fallen world for anybody that's expressing some of those innate figures. But I thought for just a minute we might get to this other one of rapid onset gender dysphoria, because some of that seems less, if you will, nature and more nurture. And it seems like some of that is, well, it's kind of trendy, and I don't want to be cavalier about that at all, but I am recognizing that this has been something that people have identified as individuals that once one young girl, for example, says, I think I'm a boy, all of a sudden all the others start saying that as well. So what do we know about this whole idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria?
Yeah, that's I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm really excited that you've already talked about it on your show. It's something I think many people need to talk about. So rapid onset gender dysphoria, just as a reminder to the audience who may have heard you talk about it, has to do with the the sudden rise in teenagers, especially female teenagers, identifying as something other than their biological sex, whether it's transgender, genderqueer, non-binary, or there's several other identities that they choose for themselves. So, in the UK alone, there's been a 5,000% increase in biological females, teenagers, going to gender clinics and questioning their gender. And that's just unprecedented. For one, the history of gender dysphoria, what we know is it's primarily a male issue. I think it's like 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. It's been biological males who experience gender dysphoria. But now there's been a massive increase among teenagers identifying, but not just teenagers, but females. There's been an inversion in the sex ratio, which has caused the most liberal psychologists to raise an eye, saying there's something going on here. This defies just simply, a biological reality. So there's a scholar, Lisa Littman from Brown University. No, she's not conservative, not a Christian, who did a big study a few years ago, and she's the one that coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria. And so she surveyed over 260 parents who had kids who seemingly out of nowhere just kind of came out as trans. And then you look at their social environment, and 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of their friends came out as trans around the same time. Then you look at their social media use, and they're spending 6 to 8 hours a day, looking at, kind of trans activist type social media outlets. And so she proposed, and I think she's right, that there's some level of social contagion going on here. We already know that female teenagers are susceptible to things like eating disorders, and even suicidality is shown to be socially contagious. And so it's not unreasonable to at least raise the suggestion that identifying as trans among teenage females is at least in part influenced by society. So, and where the rubber meets the road here is if you're in an environment where the medical community is going to really quickly begin the transitioning process of a 13, 14, 15-year-old girl.
There you go.
That's ethically suspicious, to say the least. And that's not, and just to make it clear, these are not just like conservatives raising this concern. There's a lot of people who are pro same-sex marriage, who are even pro transitioning, but they're like, it doesn't seem ethical to almost fast-track a 15-year-old through transitioning when we're already seeing a growing number are regretting it later on. So it's raised a lot of ethical questions in society today.
We want to get to the issue of transitioning in just a minute, but I thought I left out, but I wanted to at least mention it and maybe just give it a minute or two before we take a break, the idea of intersex, because that's brought up sometimes too, in which you have a kind of an interesting set of symptoms that surface because of the genetic issues. Can you address that real quickly?
Sure. So far we've been talking about trans identities or gender dysphoria as a psychological condition, and that has to do with the mind. Okay, there's nothing in the body of somebody who has gender dysphoria necessarily that they would question whether the person is biologically male or female. Well, intersex is the opposite. It has to do with the sexed bodies. There's anywhere from 16 to 20 or even more different kinds of intersex conditions, where there's some kind of atypical feature in a person's sexual anatomy. Now, the most important thing to understand, and this is where I rarely see people acknowledge this, an overwhelming majority, in an overwhelming majority of cases where somebody has an intersex condition, that condition is so minor that there's no question whether they are male or female. In fact, Leonard Sachs, who's an expert in this area, he estimates that about 99% of people with an intersex condition are clearly male or female. But there are a few that are much more severe, where a friend of mine has complete male and complete female anatomy, and they would be. I mean, we can talk about, what identity my friend has, and they would say, I'm both. Like, I literally have both male and female anatomy, male and female genetics. But we need to consider intersex as kind of its own category, not try to map that upon the trans
I would agree. And again, I appreciate you putting a chapter in there, because that's the question I get sometimes when I speak on this, which isn't as often as you do, but I certainly have sometimes had to. But when we come back, what about this idea of transitioning? What about pronouns, bathrooms, a couple other issues? And again, I think some great material that is available in this book, Embodied, and we'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Dr. Preston Sprinkle with us as we talk about Embodied. And I thought we might focus on transitioning and the whole idea of especially how a Christian would think about whether a Christian should ever transition. But another part of that, Preston, is something that I've been documenting for some time when I speak on it. The increasing number of stories that you can find about what's called transition regret. And I think you also addressed that in Chapter 10. So kind of help us through this issue, because it has become an issue where, especially when you're talking about the rapid onset gender dysphoria, if somebody wants to get some kind of medical intervention with hormones, sex reassignment surgery, that's pretty permanent, and the amount of regret that we are documenting now illustrates again how unwise that would be. But I want to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I would agree. And when, aside from transitioning and the ethics of it all from a general kind of standpoint, I don't know. I can easily jump in and say, for a teenager who came out kind of within a context where there seems to be some sort of social contagion, they come out as 13, 14, 15-year-old, as a 15-year-old, identifying as trans. I don't think, just from a parental perspective, let alone a Christian one, that the next step should be medical transitioning, especially when something we didn't mention, but with the group of people who fit in the rapid onset category, an overwhelming majority experience 2 to 5 different mental health issues, including past trauma. A high percentage are on the autism spectrum. Oftentimes they have repressed misogyny. They just don't like being a girl. And I mean, we need to deal with those issues first before we start considering transitioning. But on a general level, when we think about transitioning, I like to propose 3 different lenses through which we should view this question: the ontological lens, the ethical, and the practical. Ontological lens simply asks the question, who are we? Are we, if we're biologically male, for instance, but we don't resonate with that, we have an incongruence with that, with the body that we are, then which one are we? Because Christian discipleship is oriented towards living out the divine image that God created us to be. And so I do think that our sex bodies are part of that image. And so if we ask the question, who are we? We are what our biology tells us to be. So transitioning would be moving further away, not deeper into who God created us to be. Then there's the ethical question about, is it even ethically valid from a Christian standpoint to transition? And again, going back to Genesis, if our sexed bodies are part of how we image God, then I would say the burden of proof would rest on somebody else, to argue, it would rest on the other view that says transitioning is perfectly morally permissible. I would say, well, how would you square that with how the Bible talks about the body from cover to cover? Then there's a practical question of just how, if we're like, okay, I can solve those other 2 issues, but this is the best way to treat gender dysphoria. I would question that. Like, according to several studies, it's not that clear that transitioning is going to solve the oftentimes high number of mental health issues that trans people are going to. The suicide rate is still very high pre and post transition. Some studies show that sometimes other mental health issues are exacerbated after transitioning. And so it's not like this is what, will always in every case relieve the suffering that a person is going through. So I think, and I want to approach this with a ton of compassion. And if I'm willing to say, I don't think transitioning is the way to go, then I should also be willing to walk alongside a person who's going to shrug their shoulders and say, okay, then what do I do? I want to enter into their journey and not just lob, an ethical argument from a distance. But I don't think, at least I haven't seen a convincing Christian argument for transitioning being the thing that God would want somebody to do.
And I might just give you credit for the fact that you also have an appendix dealing with suicide and trans people. But when you see like the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why about a girl's suicide, that's not helpful. And I was encouraged that you were quoting, at least in one of your references, to Dr. Paul McHugh, who was at Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins Hospital, because he was part of that decision to discontinue that idea of sex reassignment surgery, because as you and I think other people have pointed out, it really doesn't help. I mean, the argument is that I will be happier and I won't be as miserable after. It doesn't really play itself out. But since we only have about 2 minutes left, I thought I might just have you talk about how to use this book, because it primarily is written for Christian leaders and pastors. I would say that if you're in the ministry, you certainly probably have on your shelf a book or 2, or maybe many books, including maybe yours on People to Be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue. But it's going to be important for you, even in the church and in church ministry, to maybe have a book on transgender. And we've talked about some of the political aspects of that before, but here you kind of get into more of the psychological and spiritual issues of that. So that is the case. But also, I think this would be very helpful for parents who are trying to figure out when their son or daughter comes home and says, or comes out and says, I'm trans, what does that really mean? Because you've taken the time to break it into different chapters, because as you said, just because you've met one trans, all it means is you met one trans. It doesn't necessarily have a one-size-fits-all. So I think that was another reason why you wrote the book, isn't it?
Yeah, it was to give Christians guidance on both the conceptual piece of this conversation, which is manifold. I mean, you got a lot of science and theology and ethics and psychology that goes into this. So I wanted to help Christian, especially parents and leaders, to get their arms around it, but also to do so with a humble, listening, loving posture. So it is trying to cultivate sound thinking, but also aggressive love among those who are interested in engaging in the conversation.
I might just mention that it's published by David C. Cook, so you probably can find it in your local bookstore. Of course, it has just come out, but we also have a link to your website, prestonsprinkle.com, so you can get a copy of it there. And then you have all sorts of other material that's available, so talk about that, because if people want to go to your website, of course, we have a link on our website, that's where you can find some additional information, right?
Yeah, PrestonSprinkle.com has a lot of information. Other books I've written, my podcast is called Theology in the Raw. I just did a 6-part series on the trans conversation, interviewing 6 different trans people, so you can hear stories from them. I also run a ministry called the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender at centerforfaith.com, and there's lots of different resources on this conversation as a whole.
Well, it's just been great to have you on the program. I appreciated the writing that you've done in the past, and I thank you for writing this book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me on, Kerby. I appreciate it.
Let's, if we can, just before we run out of time here, mention a couple of things. First of all, you might say, well, I'd like to get a copy of the book, and we have a link to his website. You can use that, or you can maybe look for it in your local bookstore, David C. Cook. As you've been listening to this, some of you say, it's not really an issue I'm dealing with, but I do know somebody that would really benefit from this. So can I encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. There's a place where it has a red button that says watch or listen. You could take that watch button and you could take that and then send it to them as a podcast. Or, of course, we'll also have it on YouTube, so you could go with that there. And so pass it on to others. It might be somebody who's dealing with this issue of transgender, might be a parent or a grandparent that's dealing with it, or it might be your pastor that says, I'm hoping I never even have to get the question asked, but sooner or later I'm going to have to deal with that. And you might really benefit from that being passed on as well. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to devote an entire hour to this topic. That's one of the reasons why we have information on our website at pointofview.net that you can pass on to others. So I thank you for listening, and you've been listening to Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup.